Yes, I know I could shoot better normally, but if you weren't nattering 20 miles an hour, I would have. Jesus. Look, you know that 1 pound prize that the captain was giving out? Huh? Yeah, well, I wanted to win it. Now, with that, I won't. That Plunkett's probably going to take it all. Who's Plunket? Oh, boy. That was close. Whew. Tell me about it. That French chasseur just about skewered me. Whew. They sure as hell came out of nowhere, that's for sure. Do you think they're gonna come across the bridge? I don't know. Our guns blew the hell out of them earlier. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Hey! Is that a French general? I think you're right. You know, I think I heard something that there was a bounty offered for bagging one, I think. Got me. But you know, that's a good idea regardless. I mean, quite frankly, I'm sick of them. With their crazy hats and their gold lace. And you know, every time you see one, you're gonna have to get stuck in sooner than you can say Boney's nose. You know what? I think I'm gonna go bag myself a Monsieur. Whoa. What? Not so fast. Look who's gonna beat ya, ha 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 ha. Damn his eyes! I mean, honestly, I was just gonna go and do that. If it's not one thing, it's another. Ugh. I mean, I know he's a good shot and everything. I mean, he took that shooting prize from me earlier, and now this. You'd think you could share some around it. Save some for the rest of us, won't you? Yeah, me too! By December of 1808, initial efforts to combat the French on the Iberian Peninsula had not met with the success as was hoped for. Thus, the army, under the command of Sir John Moore, was forced north towards the town and port of Corunna. There, it would be met and evacuated by the Royal Navy. This was not some simple tactical withdrawal. The retreat to Corunna would go down in the annals of British military history as being one of the most epic and arduous ever undertaken. The army struggled and labored to move itself over the mountains in the dead of winter. Extreme privation and exposure caused discipline to break down in many battalions and regiments. Forming the rearguard under General Paget was a small force of all arms. The 15th Hussars, a troop of horse artillery, and 5 battalions of infantry. The 20th Foot, the 28th Foot, the 52nd Light Infantry, the 91st, and perhaps most famously, the 95th Rifles. Constant small battles, skirmishing, and desperate delaying actions occurred at every turn as the French, under the overall command of Marshal Soult, advanced confidently in pursuit. With the main body of the army in Villafranca, it was decided that a stand at a small town on the River Coa would best delay the French. Thus, the stage was set for not a great sweeping battle, or even a decisive stopping blow. What would occur during the action at Cacabelos would become one of the most famous shots made by a British soldier ever. In this video, we'll seek to examine this famous shot through analysis of the ground, discussion of the tactics of the era, and of course, through the use of the weapon that fired it. The Baker Rifle. I've been wanting to tackle this project for years, and now I finally got to it. This is perhaps the acme of historical shooting with the Baker Rifle, and I hope you enjoy watching it as much as I did making it. The references for this video are primarily the regulations for the exercise of riflemen and light infantry, republished as late as 1814, and the exceptional article written by Richard Moore entitled Plunkett's Shot, a reconstruction of a famous exploit in the history of the 95th Rifles. This article is perhaps the best examination of the event and should be required reading for any enthusiast. There are other interesting and accurate examinations online as well. Other references used include the Regulations for the Rifle Corps by Ben Townsend, DeWitt Bailey's excellent book, British Military Flintlock Rifles, Surtees of the 95th by Surtees himself, Rifleman Costello also by himself, Where Duty Calls Me by William Green, and The Baker Rifle and Early Campaigns of the 95th Rifles by Stephen Summerfield and Sue Law. The campaign of 1808 had begun with a modicum of success as the British Army landed in Portugal in August of that year. The Army won a significant victory against the French at Vimiero on August the 21st, under the local generalship of Arthur Wellesley. However, subsequent diplomatic happenings left a more total victory elusive. With Portugal free of the French, but British leadership recalled to Britain to answer for decisions made in the aftermath of Vimiero, command of the army fell to Sir John Moore. The next effort was to be a combined Anglo-Spanish attack to push the French out of Spain. Incensed by the Spanish problem, Napoleon himself led a French army that would eventually number 250,000 men into Spain to decide the issue once and for all. The Spanish armies steadily collapsed in the face of the French juggernaut, and by December, the British army, now united with its two wings, found itself at Sahagun, following up a victorious cavalry skirmish. The optimism wouldn't last. Arrayed against Moore were two French corps under Soult in the north and Ney in the south. The French dispositions threatened the British lines of communications, and Moore was left with no option but to look to his rear. Thus, on the 25th of December, one of the most epic retreats in military history began. Major General Paget's Reserve Division, which included the 1st Battalion 95th Rifles, was tasked with forming the rearguard that would cover the withdrawal of the main part of the army north and west towards Corunna. Another grouping, including the 2nd Battalion 95th Rifles, were sent on to Vigo, where they would embark for home. The retreat was a huge undertaking. Moving some 20,000 troops, the transport, and literally an army's worth of stores in the dead of winter came as a shock to all. Perhaps somewhat uncharacteristically, discipline broke down, and there were many instances of troops looting and stealing, and perhaps more importantly, drinking themselves into oblivion. By the time the army reached Villafranca, almost halfway to Corunna, things had degenerated to such an extent that masses of stores, transport, and supplies had to be destroyed if the army was to keep its agility and stay away from their French pursuers. About half a day's march back along the road from Villafranca lay the river Cua, and a lone bridge across it at the town of Cacabelos. This was an excellent spot for a rearguard action, as there were no roads and attending bridges over the river on either side. Therefore, the position was relatively secure from a flanking maneuver, and made positions on the western bank of the river a very difficult proposition. Thus, the stage was set for what was to become one of the most celebrated shots in British Army history. Now, this is not an exhaustive look at the Baker Rifle, the 95th, or the Peninsular War, but some general comment should be passed on the rifle and its use. Although rifle use was not new to the Army writ large, the 95th was its first permanent all-rifle corps. The design of the Baker drew heavily on the Germanic Jaeger tradition, where shorter, handier weapons were preferred, they being much more suited to light infantry work than a longer, say, American style of rifle. As a relatively new addition to the Army, marksmanship training was generally in its infancy. More information on the shooting standards of the 95th can be found in the two-part series on that subject. Their Baker was of carbine bore, or 62 caliber, and had a relatively slow twist rate of 1 in 120 inches, the ball making 1/4 turn in the barrel. It was fitted with a 2-position backsight, graduated from 100 to 200 yards. More on that later. Despite modern internet-driven babble, the Baker's accuracy must be put in the context of the times. It was not some sort of superweapon in the modern context. And what often gets conflated with the modern paradigm is that it was quite superior to the standard weapon of the era, the Indian pattern musket, or Brown Bess. When one compares the service range of the musket, generally 100 yards and under, the Baker, shot by regulation out to 300 yards, was a considerable capability. Contemporary accounts of its use should be read within the context of the times and the paradigm of infantry warfare. For instance, a, quote, remarkable range for the era, even for a rifleman, would have been at something at the higher end of the rifle's generally demonstrated capability, perhaps 200 or 300 yards, whereas today, double or even triple that would serve as the catalyst for a similar reaction. Riflemen were trained in the usual infantry fire positions of standing and kneeling, those used in close order. But there is also evidence that a certain amount of attention was paid to alternate positions. The use of these alternate positions was not required in the musketry practices of the era, but are indeed mentioned in the various drill books and field manuals of the era. The prone position and an accompanying supine loading evolution were described, and prescription of these to be practiced and mastered was also included. Others, such as the sitting and supine position, are supported by period illustrations and texts. In the story of Plunket, it is often asserted that he used the supine position when he shot Colbert. There are no primary resources that state this, all either being written well after the fact or by authors who were not present. Discussion of the aspects of Plunkett's position will come later. The ammunition used for these experiments has been discussed in a series of videos dealing with the use of paper cartridges and the Baker rifle. I felt that a cartridge with patched round ball was the best choice to include in this scenario, rather than loose patch and ball. In all cases, I use a 5.96 round ball with a 96 grain charge of 2F. Now, another aspect of Plunkett's shot is what he was wearing. Now, this isn't so much a fashion show as it is important in the context of the time of year and the campaign that he was involved in. So, of course, the more things he had with him, the more encumbered he'd be. I'm dressed right now in sort of the bare bones. I've just got the ammunition pouch, the waist belt, bayonet, expense pouch, or ball bag. Now, for sure, Plunket would not have just been wearing this. He was on a campaign, and for that, he would have been at the very minimum wearing this. Because he's on campaign, he would have been issued a water bottle, the standard British fare of 2 quarts and, well, a leaky keg-like construction, and a somewhat large haversack to carry his food and other necessities. These were only issued on campaign, and most assuredly, on the retreat to Corunna, the men would have carried at the very minimum something to carry food and water in. Now, the next aspect to consider is also the fact that because they were on campaign and they were in the Napoleonic era, and during that time there basically was no transport available for the men at least. Therefore, their entire world had to be carried on their back. And for this, they had to carry their knapsack. Now, the knapsack was issued to every man, and as I mentioned, their entire worldly possessions were carried in it. A blanket, a mess tin, spare clothes, spare shoes, whatever they needed to according to regulations, and if there was room, whatever they wanted. Finally, there's one more item to consider. It, of course, was the dead of winter. Now, I can't really replicate the conditions here, as much as I prayed for snow last night, but it was a miserable time of year. there is a chance that the men, if in possession of them, were wearing the greatcoat. Was Plunket wearing his greatcoat? We'll never know. But chances are, if he had one, he probably was. Now, after all that, a quote was brought to my attention by a friend of the channel, Ewan. Taken from the memoir of William Green of the 1st Battalion 95th, he is very clear in that the colonel of the 1st Battalion ordered the men to abandon their knapsacks, keeping either a blanket or greatcoat. He goes on further to suggest that this was an order easily obeyed. So, in retrospect, it would seem that the 1st Battalion were equipped with the clothes on their backs, which could have been either their green jackets or their greatcoats, but without knapsacks. Nothing is certain in the realm of anecdotal references. So, although this examination of Plunkett's shot will include the knapsack, it should be taken in the aforementioned context, as a might have happened, rather than something that did happen. All riflemen were trained in exactly the same close-order tactics as the line infantry were, and were capable of marching, wheeling, and maneuver in the same way as their red-coated cousins. What set the rifles and all light infantry apart was that there was a certain specialization in the use of extended order tactics used for skirmishing and screening, as well as the myriad of other duties such as outpost, patrolling, and picket work. As it pertains to Plunkett's shot, the 95th were probably deployed in an extended order, either the normal method or perhaps a variation known as the chain. In standard extended order, the files, a pair of men, one front rank and one rear rank, were spaced at a given interval and would move and fire in concert with one another. When engaging the enemy, the idea was that one man remained loaded while the other fired and reloaded. Here we can see a section of reenactors from the Australian 2nd Battalion 95th Rifles, demonstrating extended order. Note the way they alternate fire within the file. One man fires, while the other covers him while he reloads. The files shown here are extended at a 4 to 6 pace interval. The chain was an alternate formation whereby pairs of files, 4 men, were grouped at intervals. The 4 men acted together and were, due to the dynamic of such a grouping, able to create a somewhat more continuous rate of fire. The differences in use between these two formations would have depended on ground and circumstance. Here, a demonstration of the chain. Note how there are fewer, say, nodes of fire than in extended order where each file fires independent of each other. But each 4 here can maintain a higher rate of fire than a file can. By the time the 4th man has fired, the 1st man has had time to reload and is ready to give his fire. It was as part of one of these types of formations that Plunket deployed himself and made to shoot Colbert. In following the story of Plunkett's shot, an examination of the ground is important. Cacabelos is a small town in the northwest corner of Spain, on the old road to Corunna. As mentioned, it lies on the eastern bank of the River Cua and is surrounded generally on 3 sides, with high ground of varying degrees to the east, north, and west. Here we can see the rising ground to the east. It was from this direction that the French advance guard came in pursuit of British forces. The town of Cacabelos was much smaller then, and apparently the street layout was also somewhat different, affording different views into the town from the area of the bridge. Here, the bridge over the river extends to the western bank, which pans out in a floodplain, terminating at the base of 2 rather prominent hills. The southern hill, which we can see here, figures most prominently in the story of the action. The main road extending to the top right of the screen follows generally, though not exactly, the main road that existed in 1809. It extended from the bridge across the floodplain, between the 2 hills, and off to Villafranca, and thence to Corunna. The development that we can see here to the west of the town was not in existence in 1809. Generally, the church, seen here in the center of the picture, and the mill right next to it along a stream that flowed into the River Kua were the only two major structures on the west side of the river. I've attempted to reconstruct the western bank with some hobby-grade graphics. As mentioned before, the church and the mill remain in the center of the photograph. Other salient features on the western shore were a copse of trees to the north of the road that stretched from the riverbank to the mill, effectively barring the movement of any formed body of infantry or cavalry from deploying in that direction once crossing the bridge. On the other side of the road lay a grouping of gardens and vineyards, which were defined by low walls and embankments. It is unclear as to the extent of these features, and I have shown them here to be of moderate depth from the riverbank. Further back from the river, south of the road, lay a further vineyard, with similar low walls and embankments. Beyond lay the lower slopes of the southern hill. Perhaps at this time it would be worthwhile to put some scale to the ground. The distance from the bridge to the church, where the road bent just enough to disallow a straight line of sight to the bridge from beyond, was 200 yards. The distance from the lower slopes of the southern hill to the town was 900 yards. Thus, the field of action was so defined, and somewhere amongst its snow-covered vineyards, structures, and fields, Plunket took his famous shot. With this background to the battle, the rifle and ammunition, the tactics, and the kit, we can now examine the action more closely. Paget's rearguard deployed to the east of Cacabelos in the face of the French advanced guard. The pace of the retreat was hectic, as withdrawals in contact can be, and Paget's command had been fighting such actions since the retreat began. Discipline generally remained acceptable, though the rearguard was not immune to the vagrancies of the times. 2 men caught stealing were about to be tried and punished, and in order to ensure his message was heard and seen, nearly the whole reserve division was formed up in Hollow Square, just to the east of the town. As exemplary of the chaos of war, just as preparations to hang the guilty men were being carried out, word arrived from the 15th Hussars that the French were nearby and pressing hard. The hangings were stayed, and the reserve division moved off at once through the town and over the bridge. Covering them were the aforementioned 15th Hussars and 2 companies of the 1st Battalion, 95th. As the French closed in, near panic set in, as the remaining cavalry and riflemen crammed through the town and over the bridge. The French cavalry attacked and cut up badly elements of both Hussars and the rifles. The French advance guard was led by Brigadier General Auguste François-Marie de Colbert-Chabanais, although history would remember him as simply General Colbert. As the story goes, Colbert, among the leading elements of his cavalry, was busy reorganizing his men after the hectic and confusing attack which had driven the British pickets back through the town and over the bridge. It seems clear that his intent was to press on over the river and continue to pressure the British rearguard. Colbert, it would seem, in attempting to conserve his momentum after routing the British pickets, made to cross the bridge, advancing with those of his command at hand. They were met immediately by artillery fire from the horse artillery troop and close-range musketry from British troops still near the river. Colbert wisely decided to reorganize. Elements of the reserve division were deployed thus. The 28th and 52nd appear to have been arrayed in line near the bottom of the high ground to the west, the 28th astride the road, and the 52nd on their right. The light company of the 28th were deployed in a vineyard lying between the 2 battalions. The 95th companies were positioned to the front in extended order, or perhaps using the chain. The 15th Hussars covered the left rear, while the guns of the Royal Horse Artillery were positioned centrally on the higher ground behind. At length, Colbert had reorganized and made to force the bridge. There seems to have been no British troops near the bridge at this time, they having withdrawn to the main blocking position. It would seem that Colbert was moving in advance of his men as they moved across the bridge. To my mind, this could have occurred for reconnaissance purposes. The last thing Colbert would have wanted was to cross the bridge with his cavalry, only to find the ground unsuitable due to its condition, or the confines of the gardens and walls which occupied the western bank of the river. As Colbert moved across the bridge, the story goes that Tom Plunket, perhaps motivated by the promise of a reward made by Paget himself, and in a somewhat foul mood after seeing his compatriots cut up by the French, doubled forward until he was sure of his shot. He threw himself upon his back, adopting the supine versus the prone position, and shot Colbert off his horse. Some degree of pandemonium erupted amongst the French, and an aide of Colbert came to assist. Having reloaded, Plunket shot him too. A small number of French cavalry, witnessing this, immediately made to attack the British riflemen and gain some sort of retribution. Plunket immediately doubled back to friendly lines and the safety of numbers. The French were met with British musketry, and they retired across the bridge. In this one act, Plunket not only shot 2 French officers, but in doing so seems to have imbued in the enemy advanced guard a sense of caution, and no further attempt was made to cross, allowing the British rearguard to march away unmolested some time after dark. The anecdote, as described, seems to be relatively straightforward. But, like the legend of the Lee Enfield and the so-called Mad Minute, Plunket's shot has morphed into a multi-headed hydra, fed mostly by internet buffoonery and completely baseless and contrived assertions. Within the legend, there is one major aspect that forms the foundation of this video: the range at which Plunket shot Colbert. Though outlandish claims seem to be leveling off to a degree, some have stated as much as 800 yards as being the range of Plunket's effort. It is also asserted that he used the supine versus the prone position when he shot Colbert. This too shall be examined in some detail. I figured that an established benchmark from which to build the analysis was vital to the examination. To that, a confirmatory group was shot. I elected to start at 100 yards. Now this was perhaps a bit pedantic, as I was confident that my rifle would maintain decent groups at that range. The 100-yard selection would also point to any anomalies that the muzzleloading gods were going to send my way that day. As you can see here, I elected to load with loose patch and ball. The whole evolution began with a loaded rifle in the first place, and loading from a cartridge was a bit of a moot point. Well, that's crap, is what it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I guess you've got to work with what the muzzleloading gods are giving you. Definitely not representative of what either myself or the rifle is capable of. Once the group at 100 yards was done, and I was finished beating myself up at my poor performance, the next practice was an application at 200 yards. At this range, I was still confident that hits would be assured despite the earlier 100-yard result. The target used was the Channel's No. 2 figure of Great War vintage, painted as a worthy opponent, a French voltigeur, minus the plume. What concerned me most as I began the group was the fact that I was expecting to hear the report of the hit. Setting aside the first round, which genuinely missed, the wind, ear protection, and the substantial loss of energy of the roughly 60 caliber round ball at that range didn't produce the audible cues I was expecting. The camera, of course, picked them up, but after 3 rounds, all of which I felt I had missed, I went to check the target, and was pleasantly surprised. I was a bit right in the grouping so far, but the 2 hits thus far seemed to lend a bit of promise. Secure in my confirmatory knowledge, I returned to the firing point and finished the application. Well, there we have it, a 5-round application at 200 into our No. 2 figure, painted up like our friendly neighborhood French voltigeur, or, well, he's missing the big yellow plume, but I digress. What I have here, however, is 4 solid hits. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm presuming by the general sort of right-hand bias of the group that may be 5th round, whether it was the 1st or 3rd, I don't know. I'll have to review the footage, but it may have gone past the right-hand side just. Overall, I'm pretty happy with that. As you've seen in the video, it was the 1st round that missed. Don't look now. What's that? But there's a Frenchman on a horse behind you. Where? Over your right-hand shoulder. Over my right shoulder. Oh, Jesus. May I present to you a General Colbert in the form of the largest target in British muzzleloaders history. Looking rather magnificent on his horse. Anyway, the legend has it that Plunket fired 2 rounds. The first round, he shot at Colbert and hit him allegedly in the head. Now, Colbert lasted, about 15 minutes before he expired, and a headshot, 15 minutes, I guess it could have happened. Anyway, that's the legend. Immediately following, Plunket reloaded as expeditiously as he could and shot Colbert's aide. Now, given that, we have to replicate that as best as we can. So, firing 2 rounds after doubling some distance, because Plunket left the skirmish line and advanced a meaningful distance to ensure that he could hit his target. So we're here to find out perhaps what that distance was, and by doubling the 100 or so yards, we'll start at 200 and work our way back closer to 300 yards. Given the results that were experienced with the 5-round application at 200, 4 solid hits and 1 presumably near miss, I'm thinking that 200 yards should be doable with 2 hits in 2 rounds. So the first proper Plunket shots were to be done where I had left off, at 200 yards. Even at that range, the huge target seemed to disappear into the distance. In order to fully experience the physical demands on any shooter, let alone Plunket on the day, I doubled some 100 yards to the firing point. Now immediately, the one thing that becomes apparent is that I am using the prone position versus the supine. I decided to use both and shoot 2 applications at 200 yards so as to better contextualize the choice of position. It took a few seconds to steady my breathing and take proper aim. I was glad that the slope on the ground was conducive to the selected position. The knapsack, with the blanket strapped atop, didn't impede my head to any great degree. At this point, all the little impediment gremlins came to roost. The reload, done on my back, was just one colossal embuggerance. The layers of greatcoat, the various belts and straps, and doing it all whilst lying on a knapsack, haversack, and water bottle, made every movement just so laborious. Now, the selection of patched ball cartridge was perhaps the correct approach. As discussed here and in other videos, what scant evidence there is points to the use of such an arrangement, though no documentary evidence exists of wartime Baker rifle patched ball cartridge manufacture. In other words, how they were made. At this early date in the peninsula, loose patch and ball seems to have been still carried as well. A common hurdle to overcome when loading on the ground is attaining enough of an angle to allow for the powder to fall down the barrel. Technically, the rifle should be held between the legs, but where I was lying robbed me of a bit of elevation, so by remaining on my side, more angle could be applied to the rifle. Extracting the lubricated, patched ball from the cartridge was a little bit fiddly, to say the least. The bullet end of the cartridge was choked with string. Bits of paper kept getting stuck on the patch, and stripping away the cartridge was overall somewhat troublesome. The ball requires a decent amount of force to seat at the muzzle. When standing, this is no issue, as both hands and the weight of the body can be brought to bear, as the butt of the rifle is firmly on the ground. Lying is another matter entirely. As you can see, I braced the butt on the top of my foot, so that I could give enough of a grunt to get the ball started. Finally, and it seemed like 5 minutes later, I was ready. Rolling back into the prone was fraught with the same bit of kit friction, shall we say, as rolling over in the first place. Not a small degree of readjustment was required. Of course, the flint didn't spark. I was a hair's breadth away from standing up and renapping and starting all over, but I thought one more try might be in order. That was perhaps the longest 2 minutes and 30 seconds ever shown on British muzzleloaders. Well, so that was the first attempt at 200 from the prone position this time. And we have one hit and one slight miss. Oh, so disappointing. One right there into his shoulder, and the other one right there, just outside. Obviously, I don't know, a little biased to the right there, but those would have been two fantastic shots, and quite frankly, if my point of aim had been a bit more appropriate, those were two headshots. That's certainly within the space of the head on the figure anyway. All right, let's try the supine. Despite the one miss, the silver lining here is the demonstrated performance at that range. Had I made a better assessment of the wind, perhaps those 2 rounds would have hit proper. As mentioned, the intent was for the second 200-yard practice to be from the supine position. I had shot this position before and even made videos about it. In those videos, I made numerous observations on its degree of effectiveness and suitability. But quite frankly, nothing prepared me for having to do it in kit and on a forward slope. Just so much adjustment and constant fiddling. I needed all kinds of elevation that having my legs straight simply wouldn't afford. This, combined with trying to get the butt into my armpit, was a struggle indeed. My findings in my earlier video efforts documenting the use of this position were certainly well-founded. It's awkward. It's not that stable, especially when you can't adopt it perfectly. And it pales in comparison to a good prone position. I'm going to forego you the pain in watching me reload here. 2.5 minutes of trying to figure out the best way to adopt the supine position led me to throwing the book out the window and just doing what I had to do. Well, in true British muzzleloaders fashion, I never cease to amaze how disappointed I can be in myself. Anyway. We have one solid hit right there in the neck. So that probably would have seen him done. But, well, I'll have to review the footage to see which round that is. But if it was the second round, his aide got away scot-free. Not perhaps the best of results, but maybe indicative of shooting in field conditions. This brings us to the end of part 1. In the next part, we'll continue the shooting at 300 yards and try to put all of the evidence together in order to narrow down just what happened on that day in January of 1809. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British muzzleloaders there as well. If you'd like to view British muzzleloaders and many other channels in an ad-free environment, free from the content restraints of YouTube and other platforms, then I might suggest you head on over to History of Weapons and War, where you can subscribe and find this channel and many like it, presented as they should be, all in one place.